Welcome back, everybody. And if you're just joining us, I'm Luke Menzel, CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council, and it is now my great pleasure to welcome our special international guest for today's summit, Mr. Michael Liebreich. Mr. Liebreich is the founder of New Energy Finance, which was purchased by Bloomberg in 2009. And since then, he's carved out a unique role as a leading global expert on clean energy and transportation, smart infrastructure, technology, climate finance, sustainable development. And I think moving forward, Michael, we need to add energy efficiency to that list in your bio. Thanks for getting up early in London, and welcome to this little Zoom call I've got going on with me and 700 odd of my closest mates.
Fabulous. It's wonderful to be in Australia.
Indeed. Well, we have to make do at a time when international travel is a little bit off the agenda, but we're really enjoying staying connected with our friends around the globe. Michael, you're here because you're a member of the International Energy Agency's Global Commission for Urgent Action on Energy Efficiency. The Commission released its report last week, but it was formed over a year ago, the Commission. So if energy efficiency was a priority requiring urgent action in June last year, what is it now?
Well, I mean, I think that the answer is it's even more urgent and also even more profound because of the COVID pandemic. And I was just listening in actually to the bulk of the last panel, and your panelists are just hitting the nail on the head. You need the short term. It plays a role in the short term recovery, and you also need the long term plan. I think it was Tennant that made that point. So yes, since the Commission was founded, we've been working on the energy efficiency problem, but then it kind of started to get wrapped up in the COP26, and the broader question became, well, what are we going to do after the Commission was always only set up to do 1 year? How do you kind of take this payload and put it into other global platforms? And then COVID came along and of course supercharged the whole thing because it suddenly becomes a piece of the stimulus. And as you know, I've argued that it needs to be actually at the heart of the COVID recovery stimulus programs around the world.
Well, we'll get to that, Michael, but maybe if we just take a step back and think back, I know it seems like a long time ago, but to the before times, before we were in the midst of a global pandemic. You've written recently on the state of play before we hit the coronavirus. Where are we on momentum towards a big ramp up in energy efficiency pre-COVID-19?
Well, so I think you're referring to the thing that I wrote at the end of last year, which was I wrote it for Bloomberg. I still write for Bloomberg, despite having sold the business now over 10 years ago, but I'm still write 4 times a year. My most recent one, well, no longer most recent, but at the end of last year, I wrote a piece called Peak Emissions Are Closer Than You Think, and Here's Why. And of course, I wasn't predicting the COVID pandemic at all. What I was saying was that actually, despite the zeitgeist amongst people who are concerned about the climate, is, it's terrible. And you have Greta Thunberg saying, you adults have done nothing. And you get these sort of disaster scenarios coming out of the IPCC and being referred to around the world as business as usual. In fact, that's not a good characterization of where we are, apart from the fact that the scenarios we're really on still, catastrophic, but they're not the extreme scenarios. They're kind of the middle scenarios, but they're bad enough, don't get me wrong. But the thing that I was, really talking about was progress on emissions. And I'll give you 2 statistics which sum that up. If you look at the period 2013 to 2019, global GDP, terrible measure of well-being and all sorts of things, but GDP measures jobs quite well, by the way, which is sort of important now. But global GDP grew by 23%, IMF figures. And during the same period, emissions only grew by 3%. Now, the purists will say, oh, but that's not absolute decoupling. We're not getting emissions going down. But, if you want emissions to go down, and we all know they've got to go down a lot by 2030 and completely by 2050 or whatever, they've first got to peak. Yep. And I was arguing that they are getting close to peaking, and there are 3 things driving it. One is coal to gas switching, particularly in the US, where they've got very cheap natural gas. But around the world, we see coal growth has peaked, very far from the disaster scenarios, which see it growing by 5 and 7 and 10 times this century, which is completely ridiculous. So coal has peaked, somewhat because of gas. The second thing is renewables. If you look at the curve of the growth of renewables globally, you go back 20 years, renewables, non-hydro renewables were, 1 or 2% of global electricity supply, right? Then you go forwards to 10 years ago, and they're 3%. And then you can laugh at them and you can sort of say, oh, it's a bit like, in 20 years ago, they ignored us. And then 10 years ago, they laughed at us. And then they spent 10 years fighting renewables. And, Australia's been on the front lines of that to a large degree. But, in 2019, non-hydro renewables were 11% of the global electricity supply, from 3 to 11 in a decade. And the curvature of that curve, if you look at it, it's just striking. And so this argument was essentially based on coal to gas, renewable energy, and the third one you'll love to hear, of course, and this audience hopefully
we were all waiting for it.
It is. Now I'm just going to disappoint slightly. I'm going to say energy productivity.
I'm totally fine with that, Michael.
It's not energy efficiency only. It's energy productivity. In other words, getting more economic activity out of each bit of energy. And some of that is energy efficiency, and some of that is as economies grow and they switch to services, or they use different building materials. Some of it is sort of pure. Do you know what? I don't care. Let's take it. And in fact, I think your mandate and the mandate of this group, in an economic crisis particularly, is energy productivity. We're now absolutely clear we need that GDP. We need those jobs. There's no debate about that at the moment. And therefore, we need to do that in an energy efficient way. And as I say, we were making very strong progress. I was saying we're going to get to peak emissions this decade. And by 2030, maybe, we know that climate says we need a decline of 25% for 2 degrees and 45% for 1.5 degrees. We're not going to get that, in my view, at the time. But we were going to get, let's say, a 5 or 10% decline by 2030, which at least would demonstrate that we're on some kind of track. There's an arc, we can bend it. But it was an optimistic view at the end of last year.
Well, of course, a lot's happened since then. We have had the coronavirus, and we've had a global pandemic and a crash in economic activity across nations around the world and across almost every sector. Where are we now? I suppose it strikes me we're a bit at an inflection point where decisions are being made that will drive next steps. The contribution from the International Energy Agency recently with their sustainable recovery plan is telling in the context of the opportunity that you just pointed to around peaking emissions. The IEA and the IMF saying, well, if we play our cards right, we can actually peak emissions in 2019. Do you think that's a realistic thing and something that we should be targeting?
Yeah, I think it is realistic to hope that 2019 was the peak, global peak of emissions of CO2 emissions from energy. You've got to be very, and maybe methane and some other gases from energy.
Yep.
They didn't speak in that report about deforestation, reforestation, land use, some of the other things. We must always remember energy is about 70% of the problem. There is this other 30%. But when I say we can hope, I think it was Paul Romer, the economist, Nobel laureate, who talked about the sort of two ways of hoping. A child can sit there and hope for a nice Christmas present. That's passive hope. Or there's hope where you hope you can build a good tree house, right? You have to, but that's not passive. That's active. You have to do something to build a good tree house. So I think we've got to be active hopers, active optimists, where we say, it is feasible, and therefore we will make it happen, is what the IEA is saying. So they've done, and this is not the report, this is not the Energy Efficiency Commission report. This is a different report. As I say, the Energy Efficiency Commission is now being is now metastasizing within the IEA and other international bodies, and I'm trying to help that. Yep. But this was a report they wrote on sustainable recovery, where they really plotted out two potential 3-year recovery paths. One, which is very much like the great financial crisis recovery, where emissions dropped by about 1.5%, but they then jumped back by 4.5%, 5%, the biggest single growth in emissions in the history of emissions. And of course, the recovery was very fossil driven and saw us then have another decade of growth. But they plot out another route which says, okay, there's this you can do, and you may never see then emissions grow above where they were in 2019. In 2019, that also maps back to my kind of peak emissions are closer than you think thesis, because if I was saying they would be down by 2030, clearly they would be peaking around 2025, something like that. And if you've now got a chunk of economic activity removed, and one of your last panelists was making the point that they are not going to just bounce back. We're not going to have a V-shaped recovery. In fact, we're going to have a permanent loss in certain sectors, permanent loss of jobs, permanent loss of activity. So you kind of, it's not something to celebrate, but COVID does mean that there's probably going to be a few percent that never come back. So if you can kind of lose those and then adjust the curve downwards by investing more in energy efficiency, and crucially also making behaviors like this sticky. In a previous life, maybe you'd have persuaded me to fly to Australia to speak to such an eminent crowd. Now you just wouldn't. Take a bit more. I hate to say it, take a bit more than this to get me to fly to Australia. But that's a good thing for the planet, right? That's a good thing for emissions. So that's the IEA's green recovery plan, and governments are signing up to it. They are engaged in it, and all power to them.
Well, look, and I think it's a really important point you make, is that we're not you nor I are rubbing our hands in glee at looking at the demand destruction that's happened across the economy over the last several months. It's more about kind of looking at a very bad situation and trying to make the best of it. And we do have a problem to solve in terms of restarting the global economy as well as the Australian economy. And if we can tailor our solutions to that problem to also address some of the other pressing problems that we face, then that's something that would seem to be sensible, Michael.
Well, yes, and I think this is a unique period, and you're absolutely right. There is no cause for celebration in the pandemic, which continues to rage on. And you only have to look at the numbers coming out of India, Brazil, hopefully not some of the southern states in the US and so on. But it's clearly, and by the way, there are countries that are having a torrid time, and we don't even get the statistics because they don't have the ability to record them. So across the developing world, Africa, we're still in the thick of it, and it's almost obscene to be thinking about the things that it enables and accelerates. But we are where we are, and it does enable and accelerate. There is not an industry in the world that is not asking profound questions. You can, whether it's real estate, whether it's mining, whether it's obviously the energy sector, whether it's transportation, whether it's retail, whether it's obviously how we deliver medical services, how we deliver education. It's all up for grabs this year in a way that just was not the case last year. And so I think in these periods of, it's almost going to be like wartime reconstruction of the economy as we come out of this fearful thing. And, we will come out, we will emerge. We don't know whether it's going to take, 4 months until there's a miracle vaccine that, that you take once and you're done, you can forget about it. Or at the other end of the extreme, we will, suffer from flare-ups, and we'll be managing it for literally decades, because there's no guarantee that if we want to be at the other bookend, you can be very pessimistic, but at the end of it, there will be, immunity, and there will be better management of the symptoms and so on. Most likely, I think we're going to live with this for probably a couple of years would be a sensible sort of business plan assumption. And everything is up for grabs during that period. And I think that is an opportunity that people have to take, because once the resolution of the situation becomes clear, it doesn't even have to be completed, but once there is a promising vaccine, or once it's clear that we become much better at managing these fearful symptoms and so on, then things are going to suddenly sort of recrystallize. Mm-hmm. And we need to make sure they recrystallize in a way that is consistent with some of the other public goods, some of the other well-being and human progress indicators. And obviously this is a kind of a long way around to saying, let's strike while the iron is hot, even though there is a terrible health crisis still ongoing. But we are in a period where the energy efficiency agenda is just resonating in a way that it just wasn't last year. It just wasn't. Let's be completely honest. But we don't have infinite time, right? Because when this is resolved, then a lot of people will say, well, thank goodness that's over. And now, buy this cheap flight to Bali and and upgrade that car. You've been waiting to get a new car, and that bigger apartment beckons. You didn't lose your job. Now is the time to, to do X. So, I mean, people are going to get back to normal, I think, with frightening rapidity once they are no longer afeared.
So you've clearly come to the view that energy efficiency has a special status when it comes to stimulus spending. Do you want to just unpack for us why that is?
Yeah, so I called energy efficiency in the most recent piece that I wrote for Bloomberg. I called it the Swiss Army knife of the stimulus spend. And why did I call it that? Well, because it does three things just really, really well. Short-term stimulus, right? You get money into the hands of people who have suffered a lot. They've been locked down, so they've got a chunk of their earnings missing. They're maybe in debt. They may be behind on their rent. They may not have been able to buy, the presents for their kids that they would normally, be able to afford. And when you get them back to work, and I'm talking about plumbers and sparks and brickies and plasterers, and of course also, architects and technical quantity surveyors and all the people involved in delivering energy efficiency, welders in the industrial energy space. There's, all fitters, all of those sorts of people. They're likely, if they get money in their pocket, it will have a very rapid multiplier effect in the economy. They'll go out and they'll spend in their communities. The second thing it does is the long-term multiplier, because you're improving the asset base of the economy. And therefore there's a long-term multiplier effect, because you improve the energy efficiency of your housing stock, your commercial buildings, and your industry, and you reduce the input costs of your economy. So it's like you've taken the handbrake off, and you finally got the handbrake fixed. Now you don't have to drive around with it. Well, that has a long-term multiplier effect. I think maybe in Australia, people's view is, well, energy is so cheap, and we look at that coal that we export. We've got but it's not cheap. We've got some of the most expensive electricity, particularly in the world. So energy efficiency will have a long-term multiplier. And then, of course, the third thing is it's good for the climate. This is a good thing. It will help to bend that arc, get that peak locked in if we've had it, or get there quickly if we haven't. And so, it's good for, people like to talk about polar bears and grandkids, honestly, but it's also good for, addressing climate change is good for us. It's good for our own families suffering in heat waves. And of course, I was in Australia in November last year. Those fearful fires and all those things, they are real, and that issue has not gone away. And so the third thing that energy efficiency does is contribute to addressing climate change. And just if I might say on that, the supply side always grabs all the attention, and not all, but most of the attention, and it sucks the air out of the energy efficiency debate. But the numbers show you can't address climate change without addressing the demand side. The path is simply too steep. Even if you say, forget 1.5 degrees, it's over, it's too late, which frankly is probably the sensible view. We might not want to say that, but even if you just say, let's really, really put our shoulders to the wheel and get to 2 degrees, you're still talking about a 25% reduction in emissions by 2030. And if you do that at the same time as creating jobs in the developed world, and also continuing these tremendous trends towards human well-being in the developing world, education, pulling people out of poverty, inclusion, jobs, health, all those good things that are going on, then we need that economic growth. So you need to cut the emissions by 25% in 10 years whilst growing the global economy to provide all the things that we know people need. Mm-hmm. And so you're talking about maybe having to reduce emissions on a kind of per unit basis, per unit of economic value add, by somewhere around 4 or 5% per year. Mm-hmm. Now, I love wind and I love solar. I love them to bits, and I love batteries and I love high voltage DC. And you know what? I even love nuclear. If anybody can do it at an effective cost point and manage all the other issues, I love all of those things. But the supply side alone won't get you to the trajectories that we need to be on. So the third piece of energy efficiency that it helps to address climate change is not a nice to have. It's absolutely core to the journey we need to be on.
It's a fantastic point, and it's a point that we often make. It is, as you say, virtually impossible from where we stand today to do it on the supply side by itself.
No, let's just. You got an extra word in there you don't need. It is impossible to get where we need to be on the supply side.
There you go, Michael Liebreich, stiffening my spine there, ladies and gentlemen. It's impossible to do it.
It's not physically, but the physics doesn't say. And I have to be careful because I'm always slamming people on Twitter for pretending that things are physics that are actually politics. Yeah. But it is impossible. Let's be clear. Just a combination of just supply chains, which are kind of like physics, to the politics, mean that we're not going to get there with supply side only.
Which forces us into this messy space of working out how you drive those efficiency gains in discrete sectors of the economy, and because it's not like you can just.
Oh, is that the time? Maybe I should let you figure out how to do it. I've given you the pep talk. Go on, just do it, right?
No, well, I was gonna pivot to the Commission's report, which I commend to everybody. If you're interested enough in this topic to dial into a 3-hour webinar on it, you could probably derive great benefit from downloading the Commission's report, which I'm sure my team has dropped in that link into the chat. But it is a very cogent, a very clear, a very compelling, I think, explanation of both the opportunity, which you've outlined, Michael, but also the straightforward and sensible things that governments might do to take advantage of that opportunity.
Yeah, so I think we were very lucky in the Commission because, the old adage about standing on the shoulders of giants, if we've seen further, it's only because of the work that's already been done. Because although, energy efficiency may not have been, performing to packed houses on Broadway, there was a very healthy off-Broadway sort of scene. And so there are, welcome to the, what is it? I actually, in my last piece, I wrote that sometimes, it takes a decade to become an overnight success. And there has been enormously good work done, whether it's on behavioral challenges to get this stuff done, whether it's finance, whether it's the detailed kind of nuts and bolts of policy, and so on. So I think to a certain extent, what we could do is just pull all of that together, and there are 10 recommendations, but we didn't have to do original research to get there. That was the good news. We could actually just synthesize, and really, in a way, I think there's one of the recommendations, which is the sort of the one ring to rule them all recommendation, is the number 10. I've got it here, and it says raise global energy efficiency ambition, because we can do what we want on the technocratic level, but at some point it's got to become a thing that that prime ministers, presidents talk about, that cabinet meetings, cabinet level talks about, and that leaderships then across the political sphere, business sphere, investor sphere, etc., really adopt, which they have not done until now. And I think that's part of what the Commission was about. There's a key word in our mandate, which was urgent action, 2 words, urgent action, not just saying, let's get a bunch of worthy people together and talk about energy efficiency, because they can do that all day long. But it's about urgent action. And I think the single, if you had to say, well, what's the single thing that we need to do, it's raising that ambition, and and there's getting it sort of built into the top level agendas. And that is critically important, because very often so first of all, climate sits somewhere in the environment ministry, which is just not good enough. And then you've got energy efficiency sits within the energy and whatever else is bundled in there around the world in different sort of political slicing and dicings. And the problem with both of those is that you can't do it without working across ministries. Right? You can't do energy efficiency in agriculture, in the agricultural system, which has got big challenges, without also having the agriculture minister of whatever he or she is called being involved. The same with housing. Housing very often is over in a different ministry, and so are schools, and so is maybe even industry. You might have an industry ministry and an energy ministry. So you've got to work at these things cross-functionally, which means if there are any prime ministers watching or presidents, you have to bang heads together, and you have to get those people cross-functionally to work on this stuff. And that's kind of what one of the messages of the Commission.
Well, certainly another way of saying what you're pointing to, Michael, is that it's going to take leadership. It's going to take really genuine leadership from government. And I remember one of your mates and one of my mates, Brian Motherway, who heads up energy efficiency at the International Energy Agency, was actually down here for our conference back in 2016, and he had this big slide up, and it said, government is crucial, policy is crucial. You can't unlock the opportunity on the demand side without government being on the field. Doesn't mean you need to regulate everyone to death. Quite the opposite. But it is about establishing those frameworks, establishing the ambition, and then backing in the action and activity which will allow us to meet those targets.
Yes, I mean, it's I've got this sort of strange position, because I sit, and the business that I built, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, kind of sits between government, big energy companies, the tech space, the investors, civic society, and kind of informs them all. So in a way, I'm a kind of mini translation layer between some different groups of stakeholders. So, if I go to a business audience, then I'll say, don't wait for government. Make lots of money, fill your boots. There's enormous opportunity. Or if I'm talking to investors, then I'll say, the time is now, look at the returns that you can get, and so on. But then, of course, policy is critical. I mean, the answer is they're all critical. You can't do this without policy, because at the end of the day, there is no such thing. If there are any libertarians watching this, any libertarians out there, I'm going to say something you won't like. Essentially, governments make markets. They are the ones that police the rules, that create the rules of law. And of course, in the energy space, they're the ones very intimately involved with creating the rules around the power markets, the energy markets. And I'll give you one example. It is a lot cheaper to store hot water than to store electricity.
Absolutely.
So we can enormously benefit from the flexibility offered by smart heating systems in the electricity system. But without a policy engagement that enables thermal flexibility to bid into the electricity markets, right? Deregulating who can bid in, allowing aggregation, making it easy to enter those markets. Without some policy intervention, you're not going to unlock that. And so, yes, policy is key. And I think the IEA probably bangs that drum more than me, partly because of their institutional setup. I mean, they answer to energy ministries around the world. I don't. I interact with them, but there are also cases where I'm going out and talking to entrepreneurs and saying, am I allowed to say JFDI? Sort of thing you say to entrepreneurs, they get very excited. But there are sectors of this where you really don't need government, or where government will actually have to run to catch up. I mean, a great example is, of course, Elon Musk, going off and challenging and getting changes to where you can sell cars, because initially you had to have showrooms, And so, they've had to sort of scramble to catch up in many states in the US. That maybe that's the California kind of move fast and break things, and then the policymakers will sort of backfill. And that's an extreme condition, or extreme situation. But I think we need everybody working to, a better solution is working together. And that doesn't mean policymakers just sort of bending over and doing, anything that a business person says if it's going to improve clean energy or energy efficiency. But it just says, let's think a few years ahead. So for instance, very deep penetration of renewables requires somebody, and luckily you've got Alan Finkel, who's incredibly brilliant at this stuff, just thinking about, well, okay, how do you make sure there's a market for flexibility, so that when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, the lights don't go out? And that requires a policy intervention, but it has to be the lightest touch possible, because if you have the state applying its capital to R&D, the state banks then investing in the companies, the state controlling the energy mix, the state controlling the energy price, then you're going to get massively inefficient allocation of capital and poor service. And the libertarians out there will all be happy now.
So socialists are less happy.
we've got enough track record in so you can't have no involvement of policy in the state, but you can't have over involvement. And in some ways, that's the key challenge of the energy transitions: is how do you get just the right amount? And in energy efficiency, you don't want some local planning department telling you exactly what you need to do to your home. You want people to come and compete, and one tries to persuade you of this approach, and one says one says another, and so on. And then the market is really good at essentially, establishing the, sorting the BS from the stuff that works. So you need some interventions from policy, but then, you also have to have faith that business culture, and also the other piece we've not talked about is, the consumers and the consumer culture. Because it's all very well saying prime ministers need to act, but, you also need a culture in which they can act. And that's sometimes, how can I put it? That's more difficult to establish. Politicians, can be very much in reactive mode. Oh, well, my constituents don't want to hear that. Yeah. End of story. Well, there's a journey that constituents have to be, or voters have to be taken on, where they have to be educated. And also there has to be some kind of tribal culture hacking, where politicians will say, look, I may be with this party, but I actually disagree with the positions that we've had in the past, and we now need to have a conversation on X. And over time, political bravery is to lead, not to follow where your constituents are, but actually to nudge them in the direction, and maybe to be very brave, but if the nudging is better. We're in a 20, 30 year journey. Yep. So, just making some tremendous, over the top lads, leadership move will get lots and lots of press attention. Oh, how brave, and so on. And then lots of other attention on the other side saying, he's a traitor and he's betrayed and whatever. But actually we need those kind of smaller steps. That's probably the right way to, to get this stuff done. And by the way, it doesn't mean agreeing with your political opponents. You can knock bits off them, but at least compete in the space that matters to the voters. And we know this stuff matters.
Well, there's, I think, 14 points that you've just made that I feel like responding to. I'll pick one. No, it's all good. All points well made, Michael. I'll pick one, which is that in the current context, in my view at least, you're right about that ecosystem of players that need to come together to drive this transition. But right now, government is more crucial than it's been in my lifetime, at least, to be on the field and to priming the pump and setting the direction for all of that stuff that inevitably needs to come after.
No, absolutely. This is a time when people are looking to government for leadership, and they're also they will accept government intervention on a scale and in areas that 6 months ago would have been unthinkable. So cities around the world are creating pop-up bike lanes. I mean, if you could, can you imagine any of those cities in summer 2019 say, oh yeah, well, you know what, we're just going to shut that lane and we're going to do this, and we're going to put some bollards and you know, can you imagine what car drivers would have done? You know, and I know London pretty well, and it would have been pretty ugly. It would have been ugly. Whereas now there's sort of, you know, and by the way, there's simmering discontent in those constituencies around the world at some of the things that are happening, but they are disempowered and disenfranchised at the moment from saying, you know, no, we shouldn't act, government shouldn't do this, government shouldn't do that. That's why I said there's a window of opportunity. But, you know, we are looking to governments to act, and cut to the chase, we are looking to governments to spend money.
Yep.
You know, we are now, you know, any pretense, you know, all these people, you know, Keynesian, you know, stimulus, it's very funny because the anti-Keynesians all become Keynesians when there's a crisis. Right? Suddenly there's a crisis. They're like, no, spend money. No, me. I need a little bit of help here. You know, I'm a Keynesian, really, honestly, maybe just temporarily, but please. But of course, there is a flip side to that, which is the Keynesians all forget that they're Keynesians when things go well. So they're all happy with the intervention during the crisis, but when the crisis is over, they're going, Keynesian, me? No, keep the money flowing, keep the money flowing. So we're in one of those moments where everybody's a Keynesian, right? And that is part of this kind of magic window.
So maybe if we take a step back to the global context again, Michael, and yeah, these conversations are going on around the world. There were some very august individuals, prime ministers and deputy PMs and ministers, sort of part of your global commission, considering energy efficiency. But then we've also seen some of the early thinking emerging from countries around the world about how they're going to apply that stimulus spending. Obviously, there's a bit of water to go under the bridge, and we don't know where exactly it's all going to land. But obviously, we've identified the opportunity. We've said that governments need to back it in. What are the tea leaves saying to you about where this conversation is going around the world?
In the end, it becomes a discussion that has to be led at the national level, but actually also at the mayoral, right the way down to the subnational levels and down into the local communities. That's actually one of the challenges, is that a lot of this stuff has to be done at a very local level. This is not about building vast power stations in the desert. This is about changing the fabric of our hard infrastructure, hard assets. So, you know, we see it progressing at different speeds. I think it's fair to say on the energy efficiency agenda, the renovations agenda, the EU is leading the peloton. So you've got already a discussion that was going on before COVID, which was the European Green Deal discussion and various sort of negotiating stages. And, you know, it will make your head explode if I talked you through how it has to go through the Commission, and then it has to go through Parliament and the various stages, and then it has to get into national legislatures, and then they have to.
Yeah, sometimes, Michael, when Australians complain about being over-governed, I say to them, well, just look at the EU.
Yes, and I mean, you know, we were supposed to have what was it called? You know, where decisions are made at the lowest level possible, but that doesn't really happen, and it happens at all. Anyway, it's very complicated. But that was all started, interestingly enough, before COVID. There was, you know, the timing was right, because the other thing is, okay, here's what you need to know: the EU does things in 7-year chunks, and a 7-year chunk was coming up anyway. Right, a 7-year sort of budget cycle was coming up anyway. And so there's a lot of prep work in terms of drafting legislation, in terms of putting plans together, and also the corridor work of getting, you know, Poland to agree, and also Portugal, and also, you know, Germany, who is going to fund, you know, vast chunks of it, and so on. So there was a plan, and then a lot of the COVID stimulus was just about accelerating. You know, you've got that magic window. Now let's sort of get this thing through as intact as possible. And obviously some of the numbers, we're talking 750 billion euros. Then no, let's do 1 trillion, and who knows what will come out at the other end of the sausage machine. But at the heart of that is energy efficiency, and in particular, really interestingly, renovations. So there's, in the most recent drafts, the plan that will probably go through, there's the plan to do 350 billion of renovations in that 7-year cycle, with 91 billion euros funded by the EU, the rest of it being then private money that's supposed to be crowded in and so on. But 91 billion euros, which is grants and investments around renovations. And then, of course, that will also get supplemented by funds at the country level, because nobody can expect the EU to do everything, to provide all the resources. I mean, maybe some of the very poorer EU countries do, but so we're talking about, the EU is not just talking about, but putting tens of billions of euros into renovations. I mean, just saying that line alone a year ago, 2 years ago, would have been unthinkable. There's also funds for, industrial efficiency. And then they do a whole bunch of stuff around hydrogen, stuff that I love. Again, I love hydrogen to bits, but as a stimulus, it's pretty slow, right? Because, if you suddenly decided to put 5 billion into hydrogen, you'd probably employ a few hundred lawyers and a few hundred engineers for the next few years. So the renovation stuff is where the money is, really going to be, hopefully flow quickly and flow well. So that's the EU. The UK, going into the election at the end of last year, the Conservative Party manifesto included 9 billion for renovations of homes. And there's a bit of kind of like, well, yes, it's still there, but we can't quite find it in the detailed plans and so on. So there's a little bit of, I would never call the UK a laggard, of course, but they are slightly lagging relative to the EU. And then around the world, you see, the stimulus plans are at various, most of them have, like Australia, done the sort of the rescue bit, but have not yet agreed much in the way of the long-term build, the phase 2. And then, of course, in the US, great progress at the state level, some very aggressive goals and targets. But, the states only have modest resources. And at the federal level, we're just going to have to wait and see. There's the presidential election in November, and depending on who wins, it will probably, take a couple of years. Obviously, if we have another President Trump term, then I think energy efficiency, I don't want to say, can switch the lights off, because that's sort of the goal anyway. But it's going to be very, very difficult environment, continuing to be very difficult. We already saw, the CAFE standards, the energy efficiency in vehicles. We haven't talked about a big part of this, and the Trump administration has rolled those back. So clearly, this is not going to be a big part of their, to be fair, there are a lot of people working hard on energy efficiency, even at the federal level in the US today. Yep. What they're doing is taking a sort of technology first approach and saying, okay, well, we may not be able to intervene in terms of putting big budgets to work on rollout, but, just in the same way that technology gave fracking, which gave cheap gas, and therefore, helped to kill coal, we could see the same things around technological approaches to energy efficiency. So it's not a desert, even if President Trump wins another term. But obviously under Biden, you'd probably get a year or so, maybe 2 years, be a bit like, ringing for service at the Ritz. There'll be a few seconds when nothing happens, and then all hell breaks loose, because there will be big packages, but they will take time to get through the political sausage making, appointing the various political appointees. Legislation is not drawn. One of the problems in the US with the Green New Deal that is very popular is that it is not legislation ready. This is an aspirational, we're going to save the planet, and we're going to also save, it's a very political statement about, about inclusion, about jobs, guaranteed jobs for all, guaranteed healthcare for all, and so on, under a green banner, which is, it is what it is. The problem is it's not ready to sign, that bit where the president gets to sign things and then show everybody. And that's not going to happen day one. So reading the tea leaves, I think you've got leaders, you've got laggards, everybody is in some way moving, but the interesting thing about the EU is just, it is not this is not an aspirational talk. This is legislation that is working its way through and money working its way through the sausage machine.
Look, I take your point completely. And when I think about the US and us being globally in the midst of an inflection point, in some ways, the US is the inflection point in the inflection point. And we're all watching with bated breath to see what plays out over the next 6 months or so. Michael, so we had a conversation last week when we were sort of talking about, well, there's all this wonderful excitement and momentum for energy efficiency, but then we sort of turned our mind to, well, how do you get to that point? How do you get from, well, everyone agrees that this is a fabulous idea, it's perfectly suited to the moment. How do you get to the point of it being signed by the president or the governor general or whoever it might be, of actually taking that aspiration into action? What in your view are the key points for advocates, many of whom are obviously dialed in to this call, to take that that momentum and actually get some stuff happening on the ground?
Well, so I'm not familiar enough with the situation in Australia in terms of sort of the mechanics of how laws happen. But I will just generalize. There is, I refer to it as the kind of the sausage machine. The sausage machine is not just your elected representatives. It starts from the activists, the think tanks, the analysts, the progressive business people. You've got some very progressive business people, but obviously Mike Cannon-Brookes, but there are plenty of others that are pushing and creating the demand. You've got also, by the way, you've got a fabulous investor base with your very strong finance community, and sort of separately, if it hadn't been for COVID and energy efficiency suddenly being so central, I would probably be talking about sustainable finance, green finance, climate bonds, sustainable, index-related savings, all these sorts of things, because there was this kind of growing pressure from the finance community to say, well, what are the risks here? And of course, for them, it's very concrete. You just have to look at the share prices of all the fossil fuel intensive industries over the last decade. And that, even if they didn't give a damn about climate change themselves, then that really focuses the mind. The performance of the more progressive and cleaner businesses has just outperformed. So the finance community also provides pressure. So the sausage machine comes from society, it comes from business, comes from finance, and so on. What I would say is that the piece that I see missing in many countries, and I, when we spoke, I sort of quizzed you about, my impression is that it's maybe not missing, but it's insufficiently strong and developed in Australia, is the bit where you actually move from, in a sense, hoping for a good Christmas present to rolling your sleeves up and building the damn treehouse. Actually saying, well, who's going to draft the proposal? How much money should go here? What other legislative changes do we need? Who are the people that need to be in the room? And actually constructing the offer. And I know that normally you'd say, well, okay, shouldn't that sort of be, the kind of one way that works is for the opposition to do that, and then for the government to say, no, that's a load of rubbish, and then steal the bits that are most sensible,
that's never happened before.
Do it. So I didn't catch that.
That's never happened before, Michael.
Well, no, that is one route, but there is another route, which is that, folks like yourself and the people who are on this call just say, look, we're being, there is a vacuum. I don't want to say we're being let down. There is a vacuum here. We will figure it out analytically. We will also hire the lawyers and get, template legislation drafted, and then we will syndicate it around. And you just create this kind of inevitability that at some point that will be adopted, the stars will align. As soon as something becomes seen as inevitable, then the person who then some, leaders will follow because, the old adage about, I must, there go the crowd, I must follow them for I'm their leader. Once business and civic society and investors and everybody says, right, we've got to actually really get serious about our building quality because it sucks and people die in the heat waves and then they die when it gets cold as well. And we're going to fix this. And here's how to fix it. The bit that's missing, here's how to fix it. How many per year, realistic, hard-nosed legislative interventions, but also standards bodies, blah, blah, blah. It all fits together. And then it becomes, there are then political rewards for saying, I was the chap who in 2020 or 2021 put through the Great Homes for Australians Act that has, for over the next 2 decades transformed our housing stock.
Look, I think they're all points well made, Michael, and I probably characterise the situation here in Australia as like incredible enthusiasm, and also and there are actually some fantastic plans out there. There's some from a variety of organisation, and what we're at the moment that we're at right now is that effort coalescing, and in fact, this event is one manifestation of that. And I think it's going to be a very exciting next couple of months as we all start working more closely together to, as you say, have that very clear, concise offering to government about what success looks like and how they can make an impact on the ground.
No, definitely. And I think there is a moment now, I don't know whether that, obviously you're part of trying to translate that into an Australian context, but there is a moment where you need to create this sense of inevitability, this sense of this is so darn obvious. The fruit is ripe. It is there for picking. And there are, obviously, I was going to say there are no losers. The losers are the people who would like us to continue to be wasteful, which are, broadly speaking, supply side fossil fuel producers, of whom you've got a few in Australia. But this is a moment where their voices are being suppressed and dampened by the COVID situation. If there's a solution that is good for absolutely everybody else, and it's manifestly obvious, and all the stars are aligned, then I think you've got a moment where you can, bounce your leadership into leading you.
Mm-hmm. So just finally, Michael, we have gotten the message over the course of the last 3 hours or so that, there's this sort of burning platform of getting energy efficiency investment out there in a stimulus context, but we know that it will remain a massive priority well after we navigate this crisis. And your point about needing to reduce the carbon intensity of every unit of GDP so we can really grow ourselves out of this crisis, but also address some of those longer term climate challenges is a really strong one. How do we kind of get past this initial stage and make energy efficiency an ongoing priority for all of the actors, whether you're talking about consumers or businesses or financiers or indeed government, that we absolutely need it to be if we're going to solve our climate challenges?
I think the easiest answer is that success breeds success. What you need to do is and particularly, by the way, in finance, there is a moment in finance, which we've not talked about a lot, where the combination of digitization and finance puts us in a different world from where we were 10 years ago. And that's also one of the recommendations of the Commission, if I can find which one it was, is about digitization. I've got my list here, but I don't want to spend time looking for it. But why does digitization work with finance? Because there is tons of money, and particularly tons of money in Australia, that would chase good returns. And separating out the energy efficiency piece from a building or from a business has been historically difficult. It's hard to invest in energy efficiency because it is embedded in the fabric of the shopping mall or the home or the urea process, whatever it is. Now with pervasive data, sensors, machine learning, even blockchain to process payments hands off and all sorts of things, you can now financialize energy efficiency in a way that you've never been able to do. And I think that plays to some of the strengths of some very powerful players in the Australian space. And I'm thinking of your super funds, your banks, the Macquaries of the world and so on. This is a huge opportunity. Why did I jump from, well, how do you get the long-term lock-in? Why did I jump from there to finance? It's because I think if financiers, if investors can see the success, that will breed success. I mean, all these people want to do is cut and paste, right? They want to find a model and then they want to cut and paste and just make it happen faster and faster so they get bigger and bigger year-end bonuses. They're not very, it's not a complex model to understand. And I think that's one of the ways. I think there is a piece also around, lock-in with legislation, and crucially, just that cultural piece. If people understood that Australia is on a journey to great homes, because, I'm sure you know this better than me. Efficient homes with proper ventilation, etc., are much healthier and more comfortable homes. Yep. If everybody understood Australia is on a journey to ultra efficiency, we're going to, lead the world, show the way, or to hell with that, just do it for ourselves. It needs to become wasting energy, having a home with drafts in it, having a car that's poorly tuned, or inefficient and overscale and so on. That just has to become the new smoking. And then you've got the lock-in, because nobody's going to go back to smoking once they've managed to, once their community has kicked the habit, then that's never going to flip back into some worse state. So you'll get that lock-in.
Yeah, and it's something that the partners on this event have been reflecting on over the last few days is the fact that there's the multiple benefits of energy efficiency that we always talk about, but many Australians have never experienced them, whether they're talking about their own homes.
Well, you've got to talk to them in terms of their utility bills, because ultimately that's what we're talking about. Like, okay, look, take the pain now, clear the loft, do whatever. Yeah, it's not the most glamorous of work and so on. But by the way, your neighbours are going to be looking at you if you don't do it. And then you will enjoy low utility bills, better comfort. And here's another thing that has to happen culturally, but there could be a little bit of help from the policymakers, the business communities, the investors, the civic groups, and so on, like yourselves. Energy efficiency investment spending, it gets viewed as a spend, as a cost. So you have people who will say, well, I invested in a new kitchen, but I spent money on insulation. Right? And the difference is critical, because if you are in a home and you think, well, I'm going to live here until the kids go to university, whatever, and then I might sell it. And so why would I go spend $15,000 on an upgrade? That's just going to be a waste. No, because it's going to be an asset. You wouldn't say that about the kitchen you're about to put in, which you are going to recoup when you sell the place. But you do think like that about energy efficiency, better windows, whatever it is. And that's a mindset, but it can also be supported by legislative interventions around, how energy efficiency is communicated when homes are bought and sold and those sorts of things. And also the training of, for instance, the real estate sector has to be, trained, i.e. maybe, sort of smacked around and forced to understand that people pay more for efficient, well-performing homes with better moisture control and better, all those things that come together. Yep. Those are assets. They improve value. And once we start to think about that, we think in that way, then suddenly, well, you're not spending. All you're doing is saving money. Instead of putting the money into your super fund, or instead of putting your money into a savings account, you're putting it into your home, enjoying it, and you'll get it back when you sell it. What's not to like? So there's a lot of that has to happen.
Oh, look, and you're bringing us full circle to a conversation we've been having over the course of today, which is about a big part of this is transparency. It's about creating the frameworks, understanding what the energy performance of your home is means that you're more likely to invest in it, or indeed if you're selling it or renting it out, that becomes an element of the value that you're willing to put out there. Well, Michael, we're out of time. I want to thank you for your time today and your leadership on this topic. I want to close by noting that in a recent op-ed you penned for Bloomberg, you said that for the energy efficiency sector, opportunities arrived. Don't let it slip past. Well, I can say, Michael, that we certainly don't intend to let that happen here in Australia. So looking forward to keeping in touch and realising the vision of a lot of the stuff that you've been outlining here today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time, and I've really enjoyed the conversation. Good luck. This is the moment. Don't let it slip.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, that brings us to the close of today's summit, but we're not done, not by a long shot. The push for an efficient recovery was building momentum before this summit with a range of incredible proposals from a diverse range of organisations. Tomorrow, ACOS, AI Group, EEC and Property Council will be releasing a joint statement that captures the outcomes of this summit. We ask that you work with us to promote that far and wide. We are also cataloguing contributions to this national and global conversation, as we've just heard, at eec.org.au/efficient recovery. There you'll find links to position papers from the many Australian organisations setting out a positive vision for an efficient recovery, international reports like the one from the IEA's Global Commission that provides context and rationale for this effort, and details on how you can access a briefing for your organisation from an expert on the campaign for an efficient recovery. And rest assured, you'll be hearing more from all 30 organisations that have partnered on this event, and I'm sure many more beyond. Thank you to today's speakers, Dr. Alan Finkel, Minister D'Ambrosio, Minister Keane, Dr. Cassandra Goldie, Ken Morrison, Tennant Reid, Alison Rowe, and of course, Michael Liebreich. Thank you as well to ACOS, AI Group, and the Property Council, and especially Kelly Court, Frankie Muscovic, and Tennant Reid, all of whom went above and beyond in the big effort to pull this event together in a little over 2 weeks. And thank you to the other 26 supporting partners that have signed on for the event, for their ongoing work in this space and the incredible effort they've made to amplify the message of this particular event. We all need to work together to build momentum for an efficient recovery. We can create tens of thousands of jobs at the moment when we need them most. We can lower energy bills for businesses and households. We can make our buildings healthier and more comfortable and position Australian businesses for the 21st century economy. But none of this will happen without decisive action from government. And now is the perfect time to act. We look forward to working with you all to make that vision a reality. Thank you, and we'll talk again soon.